Welcome everyone. My name is Christoph Grossbeyer. I am with Celonis, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to another Celonis customer webinar. I will be your host for the next 45 minutes to an hour, and I'm very pleased to have Richard Cooper from Vodafone joining us today to talk about how Vodafone, one of the world's largest telecom operators, is using Celonis as a part of their digital transformation journey. Before we get started, just some minor housekeeping items. The session will be recorded and the recording will be shared with you after the call. There's also going to be a Q&A at the end, so feel free to submit your questions via the GoToWebinar panel at any point of the presentation. You can see it on your right. And all attendees will be muted throughout the session, so the way to interact with us is either by posting a question or reaching out to us via the chat. All right, so what are we presenting today? I want to first give you some brief background about the opportunities our customers tap into when using Celonis. Then I'm very glad to hand it over to Richard, who will share great insights into the journey he and Vodafone have been on together with us. And then at the end, we have plenty of room for questions at the end. So make sure you're posting these questions throughout the presentation. We collect them and then answer them collectively at the end. All right, so let's get started. So one of the key things that we see every day in the marketplace, working together with our customers and organizations, is that we are entering the era of digital opportunity. Customer expectations are constantly rising, driven by digital native companies like Amazon, like Uber, like Facebook, that provide a better, a faster, a more efficient customer experience and flawless execution. So companies have to rapidly change, do more to meet the customer expectations, not only though to keep up with the existing competition, but to be able to compete with new players in the marketplace. But what we see often and often again is that established organizations, companies that have been really successful so far, for them it's really hard to transform. The change is really hard for them. And why is that? Because over the time when they established a business model and have been really successful executing against this business model, they've organized themselves into vertical structures, working in silos and blocking cross-departmental communication and collaboration. And also the measure of change is often wrong, because optimizing in silos, if you're running these individual metrics, then you're only getting better at executing that part of the value chain that the individual silo is responsible for. And that might feel right at first, but the customer on the other side, they really see the end-to-end value chain. They don't care where their experience broke. Is it in procurement? Is it in finance, supply chain, customer service, and so on? They just see the end result. Something broke while I was interacting with that organization, and they're dissatisfied. So what to do? Well, it's really about transformation. That means that companies have to break down these silos, have a collaborative effort across the organization to focus on delivering value to all stakeholders. So instead of trying to optimize each individual silo, it's really about making progressive recommendation to execute more intelligently end-to-end across the entire value chain for your customers. And Celonis can help you just to do that. So the foundation of what we do at Celonis is based on a technology called process mining. And process mine uses the fact that in executing your business model in your organization, you have IT systems in place that support these value chains. And these processes that are the definition of these value chains, they run across systems, they run across departments, they sometimes even run across organizations. And every interaction in these processes leave in the IT system a digital footprint. You know, I have a purchase order that I created, I have a customer service ticket that was issued, I have a custom order that was received externally. And Celonis uses the fact that all of these event logs are already logged in your system, and we are using and leveraging that raw data to reconstruct that process, help you to understand what actually happens in your process, and then have technology in place to guide you through that transformational journey from the identification of the pain points, where do I have to prioritize in order to make change, in order to the execution and supporting that transformation. And we've been really fortunate at Celonis to work with some of the leading customers in the world, from small to large organizations, to support them on their digital transformation journey. Today, we have customers across 15 industries, more than 350 enterprise customers worldwide. And it's always amazing to see what the technology that we provide to these customers, how it is leveraged by change agents, by these organizations to make a difference and accelerate that digital transformation. And I'm especially excited today to share with you an example of one of our most successful customers, Vodafone, and with Richard, the leader at Vodafone, who leads the process mining activities for Vodafone Finance Operations, to talk a little bit about how Vodafone is using Celonis on the digital transformation journey. So with no further ado, I'll hand it over to Richard. Richard, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Christoph. And thank you everybody for joining. I'll attempt it over the next around 30 minutes just to take you through our process mining journey at Vodafone and how we've developed as a function in our finance operations area and now use Celonis as a key critical component of our operations. So before I get started on that though, I just need to give you a little bit of a background, a little bit of history. Firstly, a little bit about Vodafone and then how we ended up using process mining. So just about Vodafone to start with. So for those of you who aren't familiar with Vodafone, or maybe even are just in the country that you're in, Vodafone is actually one of the world's largest telecoms operators. We have 25 countries, primarily in Europe, Africa, Middle East, and Asia Pacific, where we have mobile operations. Increasingly, we are operating in the fixed space as well. So 18 countries now, we have fixed operations that complement and supplement our mobile operations. And where we don't have our own operations, we have an extensive partner market network, which really allows us to work with large enterprise clients, matching and mapping to their footprint. We have around 68 million IoT connections. IoT is Internet of Things. You'll see this more and more, for example, SIM cards in vending machines, hospitals, cars, and as we become more and more connected world, this is a key part of our strategy and development. And you know, a large company, 47 billion euro revenue in our recent results reported, is certainly a large number to get your head around. Trying to put that into sort of what that means for our customers, though, and actually the volume of data sort of going through our networks is quite staggering. I struggle to get my head around it, but you know, every 24 hours, our customers are making 4.7 billion minutes of mobile calls. You know, data is exploding. The streaming an equivalent of 4.9 billion songs in 24 hours. Across fixed broadband watching, the equivalent of 1 billion HD videos, and also specifically in Africa, the 20 million sort of financial transactions that are going through our network, particularly in countries where banking is less prevalent, and we use mobile technology to support customers' needs there. So it's a huge company. I think the fact we're in these 25 different markets and we're running a central sort of finance operations structure across all of those really lends itself to how do we make the most and use our data in the best possible way. And that's one of the areas that ended up bringing us to process mining. But if I just look at where we came from in terms of getting to that 25 countries, Vodafone started as a UK-based company when the first mobile phone calls were made. But over particularly the late 90s, early 2000s, and still today, you know, there was a series of acquisitions which make Vodafone the company that is today. But for anybody who's in a global company, particularly an acquisitive one, will realize some of the challenges that brings as you acquire companies. You end up with a landscape with multiple ERP solutions in there, completely inconsistent processes, different objectives, and the whole reporting and trying to do something on a global scale is very, very hard. So we took a conscious decision around 10 years ago to really address this, and we put in place an EVO program, it was called, around 4 key pillars. That is that we created a core business model, which is a set of global processes that we run. We have our captive shared service centres, primarily from a finance operations point of view. Those are based in Hungary and India. We moved a huge piece of work was to move our procurement and our finance and our HR to a single ERP system, which we selected SAP. And we have a centralized buying company, Vodafone procurement company, where a lot of our strategic large purchasing is addressed through. And really moving that market focus to a global process focused thing brought about the concept of global process owners, which again is much more common now, but 6 years ago when we introduced that was quite a new thing. And personally, I was sort of involved in that right at the start. I was one of our original process leads in the team, and sort of challenged with the view that you're I'm personally sat in the UK, but I've got colleagues in Germany, South Africa, lots of different countries. But in theory, all of a sudden you're responsible for a global process, which is operated out of 25 countries, 2 to 3 different shared service centres. And how do you possibly manage that sort of amount of data and processes across all of the areas? So that when we started, and certainly for the first 3 years of my sort of career in this process management area in Vodafone, we have this concept now. I call it yesterday, because this is the way we used to work. We prepared and created our process models on whiteboards over a series of weeks in meeting rooms in sort of conference locations, and you bring everybody together and you design your process models. I'm sure this will be familiar to a number of people listening, and with all best well intents, you design your process model and you say globally, this is the way we are going to run our accounts payable process, or our expenses process, or whichever process you're sort of looking at. And everybody signs up and agrees to it. It gets documented, and you have a process model, which should be in operation. But how do you then actually check that that's happening? So you sort of tend to then lend yourself to this sort of consulting sort of approach, and that doesn't have to be external. That could be internal. Maybe I would go and visit each of our shared service centres every couple of months and actually look over shoulders, see whether people are running the process as they said they were. Or you might involve, say, your internal audit department, who would come in and do a review of your process and tell you that things weren't happening as you were documented in the process. What are you going to do about it? But it's very much that sort of consulting approach. And you try and measure your process with KPIs, which tend to be, with all best intents, lagging KPIs. So, for example, what was my invoices paid on time for the previous month? And you might get that sort of 2 weeks into the next month, and you're sort of always sort of measuring yourself against static KPIs that you try and do some action on at the time. And that was just the way of life. That's the way we ran our processes, reasonably successfully, I think, but a lot of times it was based on less data-led decisions and more on the feedback you were receiving from teams. And sometimes you could be led by who was shouting loudest, where was the biggest problem coming from, would be based on who had the biggest voice at the table. And so in early 2015, I think it was, around early 2015, we came across process mining. And through a couple of introductions, we looked at Celonis and another company, and through the usual sort of process of due diligence and selection, we decided to go with Celonis to provide us with some process mining technology. And this leads us to where we are sort of today in our Vodafone finance operations area. So sort of 3 years down the line, having first put Celonis in, this is where we are now in our finance operations system processes. So you can see the 5 processes on the sort of red bars. We've put it in across. These are all processes where The information is within our SAP system, and all the fairly transactional processes. Accounts payable, our transactional cash management process, our assets and project accounting, which is a huge piece of Vodafone with all of our assets in network equipment, IT solutions, etc. Across our travel and expense process, and last but not least, our intercompany process. We started off with the accounts payable process, hence that bar's longer. And what I'm going to do over the next sort of few minutes is go through those red bubbles, the bars, telling you sort of how we're using Celonis process mining to really support and drive our process, to give us a much better view, certainly as process managers, in terms of where we're at any time compared to the past yesterday experience. But first, we thought it would be useful to do a short demo of the system. So I can't show you our live data, but what I can show you is we have created, Celonis have taken a copy of, let me just bring up my screen, taken a copy of one of our pieces of analysis, and here we go. And so they're taking a copy of one of our analytics and put a load of dummy data in. So none of this data is real, none of the suppliers are real, but this is a real dashboard that we've built, in this case on our accounts payable process, and looking at automation within our process. So I'll just take you through this as a quick demo. What you see on the screen now is the process overview, which is sort of at the heart of all of our use of Celonis process mining. And what you see here is we've defined the process start and the process end for this particular process, on accounts payable being the vendor creating an invoice through to us paying the invoice at the end. We have down the right hand side our process sort of variant view. So what we're seeing here is we've got 87,000 invoices in this case, in this system. We're seeing the most common process flow for those 87,000, and that's covering 49% of cases. So what this is telling us is 49% of the cases, or this 42,000 approximately, are going through this process, most common process of the vendor creating the invoice. We scan the invoice, create the invoice document in our system, we book it then into our SAP system, we pay it. The due date then sort of comes shortly afterwards, and the process has ended. That's all well and good. Looks like a nice process, but that's one of 63 different variants of getting from that process start point to the process end point. Just to put a little bit of scale on it, within our Vodafone system, when I look at a year's data, we have 3 million accounts payable invoices going through. There are 70,000 variants, which is a staggering number, but our top 20 variants cover sort of 50% of the cases. Then, you know, the remaining 69,980 are all slight different variants where, for example, there might be rework in the process, or the invoice goes to a slightly different place. It's a staggering number, but across the sort of size of footprint it's not totally surprising. What we do with this process variant view is we typically would then start looking at the top 2 or 3 processes, as that covers the bulk of it, and we try to understand where have we got opportunities for improvement in our process. You can see here I've just clicked on, you know, drag this down to include the first and second process, and I can see if I click on this play button, as I go through the second process, I can see I'm taking a loop out of my standard process, and somebody's going in manually changing a baseline date in the process of my invoice processing. I know that's an activity I'd rather not happen in there. I would then have some data to support, you know, that's the volume going through there. And in a minute, I'll show you how I could drill down into much more detail on that then to actually try and take some action. Before I do that, I just want to show you quickly, I can also change sort of this volume from the 17,000 to, one of the things I look at quite a lot is the median throughput time. And for example, I can see by adding this loop into the process, rather than process 1, which took 4 days to get from here to here, I've gone 4 days through to here and a further 6 days through to there. So I've added 6 days to my process, which in the case of accounts payable is going to start impacting my ability to pay people on time, as well as tying people's efforts up in an unwanted process. So it's something that I would take a look at to try and review and minimize as much as possible. And you can keep dragging this down. If I took the full view, this is on 63 variants. Imagine what that looks like on 70,000, and honestly, you just can't see a thing. So you have to go sort of step by step and do the ones which make the biggest difference first. But you can see, all of the different ways, and that something will go through the process. Maybe changes to documents, maybe rework where it loops back up, maybe an order that you don't want things to happen in the process. I think when I was just preparing this, if I look at, if I look at a shorter sort of thing, I could look at the fifth most common one here, and it's saying the vendor created the invoice, and then the due date comes, and then 343 days later, I scan the invoice. I imagine this isn't too uncommon in a number of companies as well, where a supplier might send an invoice to their business contact, and for whatever reason it never gets to your accounts payable department to actually process it until far too late. I mean, 343 days is extreme, but like I say, this is dummy test data, but the scenario still fits with what we see. And again, then you can start clicking and filtering on things. So I could look at only the cases where, in this example, due date comes before I actually then scan the invoice in my system, and I can start to then look at those cases, find out where they are happening, and again, take some action to stop and prevent that and improve my process. So that's how the Process Explorer works and how we use it at Vodafone, just on one of the processes. I'll just quickly show you now one of the analysis that we've built. So I've got a team of just 2 people, one in India, one in Germany, who support me in terms of creating these analytics and these dashboards. So this is one that my colleague in India created around automation analytics. What we wanted to do is we set ourselves a target to drive and increase automation within our process, whether that's through changes to the process or even just applying robotic process automation across areas of the process. But in terms of that, we wanted to know where best to target that robotic process automation and where to put those robots. So we created this analysis. Basically, it's showing us the chart. The blue bit here is showing us the volume of activities, so we can focus on the high areas of activities through the process, and the purple bars represent the level of automation on each of those activities within the process. Again, at any point you can drill down and click and filter if you want to on one particular part of the process. What we found quite useful though was we could actually start looking at that automation level by various different angles or filters in the process. So in this example, again with dummy data, but we looked at, say, like the location. Typically we might use that for Vodafone. We would list the 25 different operating companies, local markets that we operate in, and compare automation rates. I mean, really revealing, I think, currently on our accounts payable process, our most automated country has something over 50%, approaching 60% of activities automated in the process. But then we've got countries with less than 10% automation. And when you then consider that we run a global process, and so the process should be the same across our areas, across our countries globally, it immediately starts asking questions. Well, what's so different about country A versus country B to drive that different level of automation? Sometimes it's in the supplier behavior. So for example, we're also able to click on the supplier and then sort of focus on suppliers that maybe have a lower automation rate. In the case of accounts payable, it could be simple as, we have a high volume supplier on a low automation rate. One of the automation drivers we know is around the tax compliant e-invoicing. And if we can sign that supplier up to e-invoicing, it can not only improve our abilities to pay our suppliers on time, but also internally for us, improve our automation rates. So What this is really doing is giving us real data behind it in an easy to consume way to actually understand where do I focus my effort. And like I sort of said earlier, as a process owner based in the UK or whatever country you're in, if you're in a global operation, having this information at your fingertips and being able to filter and drill down and actually have data-based conversations is hugely powerful, and it sort of transformed the way we're able to discuss and allocate our limited budget in terms of where do we want to focus our efforts to improve something. So yes, this is the place where we can filter things down. Again, at any point we can filter on a particular supplier, for example, maybe look at the invoice types that are going through there. This is all in one, but you can drill right down to the lowest level to see where I want to drive improvement. And as I put the filters on, it refreshes everything else here. So I start seeing the process flow for, in this example, multi-state brokers Inc. And I can start saying, okay, where's the issue with that particular supplier's invoices? What do I want to do about it to improve, in this case, automation? We've also introduced benchmarking, which sort of comes back to my country A versus country B. Sorry, that's just because I've still got a filter on supplier. But what this does is I could put my two different countries side by side and say what's the percentage automation rate in each country, and actually then visually see, well, what's the reason for this? What's driving the difference? How many different variants, for example, do I have in one country versus another? Is that a driver of automation? Or is it a particular high volume sort of invoice from a particular supplier that I can address and challenge? And it gives me the capability to do that process insight to understand where I want to take the next actions. And lastly, I'll just show you, at any point, typically when I'm doing training internally on this, the question comes, but can I see all of the invoices sort of involved in this process? And the answer is yes. Every time you drill down and carry on the filters, this becomes smaller and smaller with what you filter down on, but literally in here you get a complete data dump. So at any point, if I actually really need to get into a particular document which has gone through, and your experts who know all of the fields in there and can really drive some sort of analysis in there, has got all of the information sort of at their fingertips here to do that without then having to sort of typically go back to a source system like SAP or Oracle and then try and replicate it in the source system. Instead of that, you've got all of the information here. So that's the demo that I wanted to show. That's just one of our analytics that we've created around automation analytics. So maybe Christoph, if we could go back to the presentation. Thank you. So in terms of those bubbles I was referring to earlier, what do we, some of the areas we really use process mining for? The first one, process visualization, that's just like I've taken you through on the demo, being able to really easily visualize where the activities are happening in the process. That's core to any dashboard we build across any process. The second one though then is really root cause analysis. So the so what, it's what question are you trying to answer? We've sort of phrased it that we are mining our analytics to inform the next best action. So the process mining itself will not improve your business or your process, but what it will do is it will tell you what is the next best action that I need to take to complete that process improvement. It's a little bit blurry, but what the image here is of our perfect invoice measurement that we put in place, where we combined 4 key elements that we saw that if we had a perfect invoice from a supplier, we can almost guarantee we can pay it on time. So we're looking at things like, is the invoice received on time? Is it submitted via one of our electronic invoicing portals? Is it on a payment term which allows us to be able to pay something on time? So for example, not on an immediately due payment term. And then with all of those filter capabilities, we're able to empower the business really to then understand where the key drivers are to improve this part of the process and take the actions to drive improvement on it. And we've been able to quantify that as well. You know, we've looked at, certainly within the invoice processing area, we've said in the sort of 2 years since we've been really active looking at our invoice processing area, we've measured a KPI called touchless invoice processing. So seeing the invoice go straight through our system without a manual intervention through to being ready for payment. And we've driven that up from sort of 13% when we started to 45% of our invoices going through that, which has saved us sort of at least 30 FTEs that we've been able to either save or reallocate to other process areas across those 2 years. Then we can look at not just efficiency savings, but for example, we can do some scenario modeling, and we've supported an area of our business looking at working capital, and particularly the procure to pay element, so the cash out part of our working capital. And we've used Celonis to build our own scenarios on our data around working capital. So some of the key benefits here is we're providing visibility on all of our purchase order and our non-purchase order payments. We're able to look at the suppliers on non-preferable payment terms. We've built in some logic and calculations to basically say, a what if scenario. What if we were to move payment terms on a set group of suppliers? What difference would it make to our working capital? And really just it highlights to the business some of the things that people were probably aware of but didn't have the data to support behind it. So for example, typically our procurement teams who drive a lot of the business through our purchase order processing were aware of our sort of payment terms and payment practices on that, but perhaps less so on some of the categories where we allow non-purchase order invoices to go through. And we were able to see that we had a lower weighted average payment term for those, and actually draw the attention of our procurement team to that to say, well, how can we address that? And should we be looking at these categories of spend as well, which may have been sort of out of sight in the past. And we were able to really try and bring about some simplification as well on our payment terms. Like I say, we through a series of acquisitions, we've come together multiple payment terms in the system. We want to drive simplification, and through this modeling we can say, if we were able to move X payment term to Y payment term as one of our standard ones, what would be the impact on our working capital? So that's scenario modeling. One of the things that we've most recently invested some time in is something called process conformance. And we've found this, I've certainly found this very, very useful as a process owner. What this allows you to do is it allows you to import or create your standard process in Celonis itself and compare your actual to what you believe your core process is. So what you see on the screen here is an example where we've recreated our process model, which exists in ARIS. And we've said, well, this is the process that should be followed if we're having a perfect process through accounts payable. And then what Celonis does for us is it actually measures the transactions as they go through the process and tells us what percentage of cases are conforming to it. So in this example, 81% of the cases were conforming to that process. But it goes beyond that because it tells us for the 19% that don't conform to it, what is the increase in the number of days, for example, that those cases take? What's the increase in the volume of sort of activity steps that is taken through it? And what's the value of transactions going through those non-conformant cases? How many violations do we have in the process so that are driving those non-conformant cases? And you can see on the right-hand side, there's something called whitelisted violations. What we found is that there's some things that Celonis then flag as a violation, but actually we're saying we're okay with that. It's not exactly how we design the process, but it's not causing us any problem in the process. It's not a risk. We can actually flag that as a whitelisted violation, which means don't consider it Celonis in terms of what you're reporting as violations and what we need to actually do something about. And then at the bottom of the screen here, you can see for those violations, it tells you what they are, the biggest sort of percentage of each violation. And it tends to be, process B is happening before process A, which isn't how we would like the process to go, or there's rework in the process. And again, you can drill down on those cases and take the necessary action. And I don't think I can emphasize enough, what it really does is it focuses sort of our process team and any sort of continuous process improvement teams on the biggest areas which have the greatest impact on the process, and that's supported by data rather than a workshop where everybody brings their idea of what the process problems are, and you sort of mutually agree what to work on without that data to support it. So that's some of the areas that we're looking at currently today and what we use Celonis for. If I just look ahead, sort of where does tomorrow look like for Vodafone Finance Operations? The red bars across the bottom are really just highlighting that accounts payable was the first process we put this across, and the others have some catching up to do in terms of us developing the scenarios and the use cases across those things. But excitingly, we're sort of moving into the even more digital age of machine learning, and actually testing. So as long as our testing goes well this weekend, we'll be upgrading to the latest version of Celonis from Monday next week. And that gives us access to quite a bit of machine learning capability, and we're really excited about the capability that will bring us as well, because we'll start being able to use things such as predictions. So we believe it's going to have a big benefit for our shared service center teams if we can get the machine learning added into Celonis to start telling us, what's our predicted volumes for the next month, or what predictions based on the past history of similar transactions through the process, which ones are going to fail in our process or not go as planned, and can we take some corrective action on those now prior to that failure happening later in the process. So we're going to be building up those cases over the coming months to really utilize that next stage. And then there's something called PI Companion, which we're going to start looking at as well. This is where Celonis can sit alongside, as part of your screen within your process and embedded within it. One of the examples that we've seen, although not sort of fully investigated yet, is around, for example, if you're buying something, you pick a particular supplier through the PI Companion. Celonis might tell you that typically that takes 30 days to deliver, whereas another supplier takes 10 days based on the past sort of history. So that's another example of a potential use case for Celonis as we go forward. So just to summarize in terms of where we're at in terms of Celonis, and particularly in our Vodafone Finance Operations area, it's really driving us to the next best action, which is a data decision, not an opinion decision. It's increasing our capability and scope of our teams, and that's whether you're in a global process team responsible for the overall process, or whether you're in a shared service center team responsible for actioning the process, or where we have our operations within country and they're responsible for maybe some of the business transformation elements of the process, and you need the local team supporting it. People transformation, I'd say, is that we are transforming the way people work and work with data to change their approach to the way they work every day on a day-to-day basis by looking at process mining and consuming that data. And some of the results we've seen, like I've touched on before, Celonis in itself hasn't increased touchless invoice processing from 13 to 45%, but what it's done is it's directed us to the areas that we needed to focus on to achieve that sort of threefold increase in our automation there. And that obviously has the sort of benefit of saving resource through efficiencies driven. And last but not least, but very importantly, democratization of data. One of the biggest things that we've had as feedback from Celonis is that we have purposefully taken the decision for these processes that we've put across that we don't need to hide the data between countries. So typically some of our reporting in the past, if you've been in Vodafone Spain, you've only seen Vodafone Spain numbers. But because of the areas we're looking at, we've taken the decision that we don't need to hide internally Vodafone Germany's data with Vodafone Spain. So we can really democratize the data and compare and contrast and empower everybody with that view to actually start looking at, well, what's internally best in class and how can I learn from my fellow colleagues on what they're doing to improve their process. So I think that's it. 3 years in, it's been a great success. We're carrying on our Celonis journey, excited about the future with our upgrade coming very soon. So over to you, Christoph.
Thanks very much, Richard. We're really excited about the results of you and the Vodafone team. It's a really great story, and we're very much looking forward to the journey ahead. All right, so let's actually jump into the Q&A. There have been some questions already posted. If you do have any additional questions, just post them in the panel. The first one was around the organizational setup. So Richard, as I introduced you, you're leading the process mining activities for the Vodafone finance operations. You already mentioned that you had 2 people supporting you with building out the analyses. Can you speak a little bit about the organizational setup and who's also using it just as a viewer consuming the analyses?
Yeah, sure. So we have, like I said, I have 2 people who create those dashboards that you sort of saw. And that's based on, we have a sort of monthly review of ideas that are coming in about where people would like to use process mining. And we use that 2 resource to sort of build out the capability and train people, if you like. We have a population of around 2,000 people in total across our finance operations organization in Vodafone. And so far we have around 200 people using Celonis process mining, which I feel is roughly the right number. Sort of that's 10% of our population. We are seeing those people as the ones who have an active role in improving the process and driving it forward. And those people are based across all sorts of locations, whether they're representing their country and needing to understand where their country sort of results sits in terms of KPIs or where they can improve, or whether it's in our shared service centers who are actively doing the transactions, or in our process, we have a central global process organization, a smaller organization. And those people we typically give a higher level of access called an analyst access as well, where they can actually also flex and adapt some of the dashboards to support the 2 people who are creating them.
Awesome, perfect. Then another question was around the analysis around automation. There's one technical one that I'm going to answer, and the business one I think you're more capable of answering. So the technical one would be, how is the automation defined within the Celonis analysis? So what we're doing at Celonis is we're looking at the type of event log that is in the system. Was that event logged being logged from a dialogue user, so a human interaction, or was it logged by the system itself, by an RPA bot, or by any other automation technology you might have in place? And based on that, we can derive the automation rate. So the automation rate is basically the division between the number of automated activities divided by the cumulative number of all activities, to give you the sense of how automated that activity is overall. The business related question then, building the bridge there, is you've showed the automation analysis. Richard, how do you see Celonis helping you to on identifying as well as monitoring automation opportunities in your processes?
What it really does is it highlights to you the areas where there's a lack of automation. As simple as that. And what it then does is then it really supports the conversations you or we have with our robotics team, whether that's in the IT area or external provider, to actually say, well, this is the area that we want to apply a robot to because it will bring most value to my overall process.
Awesome, yeah. And I think, you know, another point to that is also you can then not only see where to implement, but really have the opportunity also to monitor as these automation rates change, if that RPA or any other sort of automation technology has an impact on your overall end-to-end process.
And one thing sorry, Christoph, just one thing I'd build on that actually is that through creating automation analytics has actually furthered our agenda on standardization, which was a sort of unintended consequence, but the two are so closely linked that we start seeing from our automation analytics where we have lack of standardization, and actually maybe we need to address some process or policy issues which would standardize it before you then automate.
Yeah, no, perfect. Then another question was, and I know you've touched a little bit on that, is so we looked at the accounts payable process. I think you mentioned a couple of others. Can you provide just some small examples around what other processes you're looking at as you're rolling out Celonis?
Yeah, so within our finance operations area, at the moment, we're really focused on where we've got transactional data in our SAP system. So our sort of next biggest volume is our assets and project accounting. So we trace from the sort of drawdown of project budget through to where it's creating an asset under construction, through to the final capitalization of an asset. And that's really useful in terms of telling us sort of the throughput times and where we have blockages in getting assets capitalized. So that's probably the next biggest. We're also using it across our intercompany process. Our intercompany process is relatively complex because we have a central Vodafone procurement company. So a lot of intercompany goes from our countries to the Vodafone procurement company to then the supplier. So we're able to track and monitor that process and ensure that that's working as designed. Our transactional cash management, we particularly focus on the level of automation around our bank statement clearing process. So how many receipts or payments can be allocated automatically versus where we've got manual intervention. And lastly, on our expenses process, we're really using it to monitor the throughput time and ensure that any approvals are happening in a timely manner, and we use it to some extent as well to look at the classification of expenses, but we try and do more of that in sort of other systems because that's more reporting rather than process mining. And just to finish though, so that's just for finance operations. We do use Celonis in other areas of the business. So at the same time we started our journey with finance operations, our colleagues in our procurement team developed the same sort of technology across our procurement process. So looking from when people start raising shopping carts in our system through to purchase orders. And some other areas of our business are looking at areas around customer operations, and sort of customer service ticketing, and those types of areas. But that's all sort of happening recently, I guess, those areas in the last 6 to 12 months on the back of the good work that we've seen, success this has brought to the supply chain management team and to the finance operations area.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's adding to that point that what you've mentioned is, you know, the finance operation mostly sits within the SAP ERP, but there we also see expansions in other areas around other systems that are just outside of the ERP, just for example, as the customer service ticketing system that sits within a different system. So just when we're looking at the time, I have one final question that I want to ask you is the implementation effort. If you're looking at, how long has it taken? How much effort was it to implement? Can you give a little perspective about this?
Sure. So we initially purchased the license at probably the end of March because we were connecting to our SAP systems. We were bound by our own internal sort of release timeline, so we took the next available release, which was sort of October. So it took around sort of 6 months for us working together to actually create the sort of mapping from the transaction logs through to something which makes sense as a process mining view. So I believe it can happen faster, but that was sort of pretty standard for us. So probably 6 months to build up the first one and develop the first 3 or 4 dashboards. But we've now at sort of 60 plus different dashboards and analysis across our process areas that we've built up. And once it was rolled out and technically all hooked up, we're able to create new dashboards and analytics very quickly. So the working capital example I showed you with sort of 9 different scenarios in there, we built up ourselves sort of in 2 weeks, and we're sort of demoing it back to the business within sort of week 3 of that sort of process. So and that was all internal effort without requiring to bring in Celonis or other system integrators to support in that. So once it's up and running, it's very quick and easy to adapt.
Perfect. Yeah, thanks so much. Yeah, so by looking at the time, I'll close down the webinar now. So thank you very much, Richard, for sharing the story where you are today, where you've been yesterday, and where the journey might lead you in the future. We're really excited about being on this journey together with you. Thanks to everyone who's been participating today. If you have any questions or want to try out Celonis, there are 2 easy ways of doing that. On our website, we have a trial cloud where you can actually do what Richard has done on demo data as well, and get a feeling about how the technology works. Or you can directly contact us. We'll send out the contact details shortly, as well as the recording of that webinar. So make sure that you are attending the next custom webinar coming up. Thanks very much, and I hope you have an enjoyable weekend.